I'm afraid to count how many years we have known each other. The roots of our friendship go back maybe half a century. When I was younger and more stupid, I used to create idols for myself. There were a few of them in my youth. The longest standing ones were my father, my mentor. Being young, I didn't see any weaknesses in my idols. Later, I found some drawbacks in them. But I still continue to love them. Maybe wisdom comes with the ability to see defects in your idols, but to continue to love them in spite of it. With Igor, everything went in the opposite direction. I started knowing him without any sign of idealization. Rather the opposite. I have an excuse. How can one admire somebody a couple of years younger than them, with no visible great achievements? You know, when you are a little bit over 20 and the other guy is a couple of years younger, you cannot take them seriously. Igor is from an average family. His mother passed away when he was in 5th grade. His father, Roman, your average cab driver, was very friendly but far from being smart. After Igor's mother was gone, Roman would behave the single man without any responsibilities. He changed his girlfriends pretty often, and his attention was on wrestling and dogs. The last straw in this child-father relationship occurred when Roma sued Igor over an apartment. Housing being a big deal in Ukraine in those years. I first met Igor because of Zhishka, a black Russian terrier brought by Roma and left to Igor's care. I was a big man in the dog world back then, and this breed was my favorite. I did not feel any sparks between Igor and me at the time. We had met on several occasions and only tangentially knew each other. Around this time, Igor had earned the title of an all-Ukrainian champion in classic wrestling. It was in a certain way the product of his father's attraction to sports. For a young boy, he was a valuable achievement, and later it helped him to enroll in the Agricultural Institute. In this damn dead country, winning a championship like that could somehow compensate for their applicant Jewishness in the eyes of the Higher Education Admission Committee. Our next contact occurred 5 years later. I was a postgraduate and Igor had a year left to his veterinarian diploma. These circumstances tied us a bit closer together. In this period, I lived in a small room only 200 yards from my house. There was no longer any connection between Igor and his father, and as a student, Igor had hardly the money to eat every day. I wasn't rich, but I was able to invite him to dinner or supper. We chatted during those meals, and at one time I suggested that we open a private business together. Anyone from the US will be unable to understand our life as it was then and there. It was a Soviet life. Any private activity was strongly prohibited. It was considered the equivalent of an anti-governmental activity with all the consequences. There could only be one employer, the state, and the people with intellectual professions could earn very limited money, especially the young ones. Igor, who was nearly a veterinarian, and me, a big dog man, saw the squalidness of the few official veterinary clinics there. It should be said, even in veterinary school, the act of practicing medicine on dogs and cats was portrayed as some kind of a bourgeois triviality. Back in the USSR, even a regular veterinarian service would begin with the same question and calculations. Is it worth to spend the money to treat the animal, or better put it down? Under such thinking, the governmental clinics provided just minimal vaccination against zoonotic diseases, and that was it. But the people, I'd say, the better part of them who had hearts, acutely needed vet services for their pets and had to look far as underground. We took advantage of this tendency. My house was not big, but there was enough space to examine sick dogs. As a dog and a cat lover, I was known rather well by numerous pet owners. Also, I was able to get some instruments and medicines in my science lab. The other necessities we bought on the black market. It also helped that I was rather knowledgeable in the psychology of animals, while Igor, in addition to the guidance he had received in vet school, had read almost all of the obtainable literature on the veterinary treatment of small animals that he could find. He was also theoretically familiar with the terminology of diagnosis and pharmacy. So the future of our business looked pretty good. Вопрос. Нормально, что я смотрю книжку? Okay. Our first real client, and I will remember her forever, was a 5-month-old German Shepherd. The puppy had stopped eating. It was crying, it had a fever, and it did not let us touch her back. The owner of the shepherd had already visited the city clinic and, aside from a rabies vaccination, got no help. Somebody recommended her to go to our place. At first look, we did not know where to start. Igor, for some reason known only to him, put his finger up the dog's anus, which the puppy had tried to keep especially untouchable. He found a sharp piece of bone there and took it out. As soon as he did this, the puppy went back to normal. It stopped crying, it started begging for food, and ate everything we gave her right away. The fever had disappeared, and while we were taking to the owner, "Miracle, you are miracle vets," the woman was very grateful. Because of this woman, word spread instantly brought us popularity. We started making money without a marketing push. Good for two impoverished intellectuals. Our next big deal happened a couple of weeks later. An Airedale Terrier had a fight with another dog, and his enemy had cut his ear to bits. The city clinic proposed to cut off the ear entirely and to wait while it healed itself. A dog's ear, what's the big deal? The terrier owner had already heard about the magical young vets. He came to our place when I was out, and Igor ran to find me. At that time, a regular telephone was an unattainable luxury for most of us, and cell phones didn't even exist yet. He found me on the seaside where I was having fun with my little son. "Hey, come home quickly, we have an emergency." The surgery was performed on my dinner table using the sun instead of lights. Instead of general anesthesia, we used some light local anesthetics available at any drugstore. We had no surgical equipment and had to sew up the wound with pliers and regular thread. But due to my dog show judge background, I was able to place the pieces of the ruined ear in the shape that matches breed standards. It worked. We gave the owner whatever antibiotics were available to us, and he left the clinic. 10 days later, the terrier's owner showed up at my door. I was afraid that some complications had occurred from the non-sterile procedure. The owner was absolutely ecstatic. The dog's ear was okay, perfect even. Now the form of the injured ear was much better than it had been before the accident. That's why the owner came, to ask us to perform the same surgery on the other ear. Unfortunately, our successful vet practice soon reached its end. We lost our awareness and disposed our self-made business cards at the dog club. One of them got to an employee of the city clinic who felt ignored and disrespected by our activities, meaning he needed a bribe. Soviet jurisdiction tended to severely punish those who openly ventured into entrepreneurship. Luckily for us, my father had connections, and we both were allowed to emerge from this investigation without a significant damage. We terminated our illegal vet practice, but since then our friendship has only grown stronger. The next memorable episode was related to Igor's farm training. You see, Soviet vet school students were required to undergo 6 months of real practice on an industrial farm before they could get their diplomas. Igor was very nervous. What happens if I make an incorrect diagnosis while I'm out there, he worried. What if an expensive steak cow dies because of me? I helped him to pack his luggage with dozens of handbooks. 6 months later, Igor came back. How was it? I asked. Did the handbook help? Yes, a lot. The calves died pretty often, and I had to fill out paperwork with their diagnosis. The real cause of death was always undernourishment, but it was prohibited to write this. So the handbooks helped me fill out these papers, sometimes with very exotic diagnoses. Finally, Igor graduated and was the norm in our country. He was recruited to serve as a private soldier in the army. From our native southern city, he was brought to a faraway region in northern Russia, where he spent a year. We mailed letters to each other. While Igor was in the army, I had finished my dissertation and became a low-level boss of a small military lab. After the end of Igor's military service, he came back to our city and I tried to get him into my lab. My efforts to do this were curtailed by the big boss who said, 2 Jews in one lab? It's too much. Igor needed to make a living. The only position he could find, it seems to me, Roma. Igor's father had some influential connections there. If that was the case, it would be the second and the last time Igor received any sort of positive support from him. There were a couple of evenings during this period when we dined on chickens he had gotten from his job. Igor was proud to feed me back then, but this period of being well-fed did not last long for him. The factory traditions included stealing. Everybody did it on a huge scale. It was the veterinarian's duty to cover up this side of the administration activity. But Igor was very much afraid. In such conditions, you have one choice: to become a part of the thievery or to leave. Igor left. Isn't it strange? A veterinarian with meager salary demands could not find a position. Those were the circumstances in which we lived. He was rejected from working in the lab for being Jewish, and he was rejected from working in the industry for being too honest. Igor's fortunes turned after I got a grant to do research on a fur farm. The grant was small, but its execution was outside the jurisdiction of my employer, the military lab that I had rejected Igor's application on the grounds of his Jewishness. Because of this, I was able to hire Igor and face only a minor fight from a human resources department. We got good results there, by the way. Around the same time, Igor had met a woman. She was a single mother from a respectable Jewish family that made really good money, though unofficial, illegal entrepreneurship. Igor behaved perfectly as a stepfather for the girl and was a very nice husband. The woman's parents were happy. In addition to everything else, Igor had a good appetite. It has to be explained that the woman's father, a successful underground businessman, had good money but bad health. And so did her mother and other relatives. The refrigerator at this house was always overloaded with various delicacies, the most obvious sign of prosperity in this dead country. They had everything, and a lot of it: meat, caviar, exotic fruit, and berries, cakes. But due to their ailing health, they were unable to consume these toxic products. Igor, the only daughter's groom, could eat anything he wanted. The family was pleased with this ability. Before the wedding, Igor ordered a suit from a very experienced tailor. The tailor damned this order. Igor's size changed dramatically from one fitting to another. The hunger days of his youth were over. Once there was a party at my home, and Igor brought around 20 pieces of fatty, very sweet cakes for the 20 people I was expecting. He had arrived early, and I needed another 20 minutes or so to finish getting ready. By the time I was done, there were no cakes left. Igor eaten them all. Because of Igor's eating habits, maybe for the other reasons, he got diabetes at the early age of 27. It was sad. Perhaps I was the first who pointed out to him that something was wrong. We were on an expedition to the lab of my mentor at Kaltushin, near Leningrad. My mentor had organized a good team of young researchers to solve an important problem. Each of us had our own tasks set out for us, but progress depended on our mutual success. But Igor was too tired to keep pace with the rest of us. Then one day, when we got a day off and went sightseeing, Igor slowed us down. He stopped every time we passed the store to buy a drink water. Something was definitely wrong with him, but we had not yet realized that it was juvenile diabetes. It wasn't long before the diagnosis was confirmed. During these years, and in this country, this sort of diagnosis was basically a death sentence. There wasn't any good insulin available. It was impossible to keep consumption because so little was available to us, and the longevity of the patients with juvenile diabetes was short, and their way out was very painful. Igor was sad, but his wife was panicked. She was in the early stages of pregnancy with their first mutual child, and she was afraid that the baby would have bad genes. And one can understand her. It's hard to live and expect the baby will become very sick one day. If not today, then tomorrow, or the next day, or the next week. Nobody should judge her while she's not in her shoes. She already had a daughter, and to take the risk was not worth it. It was her decision to make, and she decided to get an abortion. Igor's dream about having his own child was ruined. His first wife was rather spoiled from her childhood, and she would not agree to such a life, to be tied down to a marriage to a person with a difficult chronic illness. They divorced. Weak and without a light at the end of the tunnel, Igor seemed very lonely. He occupied a cheap room in a multi-family apartment. He had little money, poor career prospects, and nobody to support him. I was, on the other hand, expedition at the time, but even if I would have been there, what could I have said to him? Igor has always had many friends, but they should not be blamed for his loneliness. There was no sign of hope to motivate him. It was really hard to talk with a person in this condition. Anyway, that was how I felt back then. Now, I feel there are no excuses for me in that case. I had just come back from my expedition when I received terrible news. Igor was in a mental hospital. He had poisoned himself with some drugs. Researchers have easy access to such things in a lab, you know. I ran to visit him with some homemade snacks. Igor stepped out to meet me in front of the hospital with an almost vacant look and a senseless smile on his face. We talked about something meaningless, and I retired, practically escaping. It was really impossible to be with him. What could one say to be honest and hopeful? How could one heal his wounds and avoid hurting his feelings? What can one suggest? He knew better than anybody about the prognosis of his disease. His eyes were empty. I wouldn't want to be in his shoes under such circumstances. Most likely, I'd be suicidal too. Once in a while, we saw each other, but our talks were rather artificial. In fact, I'm still afraid to think about it. Igor started to build another life on the ruins of the previous one. Step by step, he came back to his research. Somehow, he found a low-level job at the veterinary school. Professor V there, a very bright, sarcastic scientist, took him under his wing. And one day, this professor introduced him to a young, lonely woman, and this introduction had great results. Igor married this woman, and she became his second and most important and most beloved wife. When it became clear, even for the most stubborn and blind-minded people like Igor and me, that nothing good would be happening in this country, the former Soviet Union, especially for our children, we decided to immigrate to the United States. At this time, it looked like our careers would end, but at least our sons would have a chance to succeed. That's what we thought. So Igor first, and I a few years later, used our familial connections to enter the U.S. At the beginning, Igor ended up in California. There, as a refugee, he got access to normal medicine that allowed him to survive, and the possibility to consolidate his professional position. He worked hard, and he passed the tests. On my side, I also found a way to make my knowledge useful there. So it appears that not only our sons, but we ourselves were able to realize our potentials in this new place. After a year of training at a vet school here, Igor got a permit to practice veterinary medicine in New York. And that was the start of where we are now. We became co-workers again and eventually started a clinic together. I don't know how Igor got his wisdom, but it worked. 30-something years after his awful discovery, Igor lives a full life. He had numerous friends, and many of them stayed with him for decades and decades. Some of them certainly profited from their friendship, but I doubt Igor could see it. He just didn't want to see the bad side of anyone, especially those he considered his friends. A couple of times a week, Igor got hypoglycemia, which resulted in a nearly coma-like state. But as soon as he brought his blood sugar back to an acceptable level, he would go to the gym or play soccer, which was his favorite. If there was a more or less meaningful game on TV, he would enjoy it with his whole heart, as if there was nothing more important. Many immigrants, even with good health, cannot get their vet licenses because of the difficult hurdles I mentioned earlier. But Igor got his veterinary license very quickly. He works, he supports his family on a decent level, meets friends, goes to parties, and partakes in many other activities. While his father was still alive, Igor took great care of him. Roman even called Igor Daddy, not vice versa. His wisdom is, do not give up. And he was blessed for his efforts to live a normal life, no matter the obstacles in front of him. He has a son, a very bright son. Igor's son graduated from a prestigious university and a medical school without taking a penny from the family's pocket. He was such a bright student that the university paid for his studies in full. And you know what it means to be on top in such a competitive world? He is now a medical doctor, and he will certainly excel at his profession. There continued to be a list of effects from Igor's diagnosis. He always feels pain in various places. He may lose consciousness during work. But he knows that life is beautiful, and tomorrow he will be with his son, his wife, his job, his friends, his sports, his fans again and again. He loves life, and he loves the people on this earth with him. He loves his animals. To come back to what I started with this chapter, idealization, I would say that our friendship started as a regular communication between people not free of its shortcomings and grew into my